Well, who is this guy, Clive Menzies, going to talk to us today? Well, he's actually one of us, and I find that refreshing. He's one of us who's taken upon himself to do a lot of digging. He's got financial services experience in areas like insurance, stockbroking, and fund management. But in addition to hands-on investment management, he's also been responsible for business development, acquisitions, and many projects. His past employers include Johnson Fry and Jardine Matheson, where he ran their stockbroking and investment management business. So it's definitely one of us who's taken the bit between his teeth, and I think he has some fascinating things to put forward to us. Clive's going to be talking for approximately 30 minutes, then we'll move to an open question and answer session where you can participate actively. Clive Menzies.
Welcome, and it's great to see so many of you here. Before I begin, I just need to recite some small print. Fund Building, which is the company I work with, I'm a director of, is a third-party marketing firm. We have no particular skin in this game, and I should emphasize that the views I'm expressing today are personal to me and not necessarily shared by my co-directors, and obviously any errors or omissions are also down to me. I'd really like to take this opportunity of thanking the Institute for organising this event, and in particular Jed O'Mara. I recognise it's pretty controversial, and as Michael says, it doesn't get much of an airing, so I'm really grateful for the opportunity to talk to you today, and I'm very grateful to Michael for taking the chair. Since I started researching climate science about a year ago, I've moved from belief in man-made global warming to outright skepticism. And I'm going to come on to that in a minute. But before I do, I think it's worth just revisiting where we went in the subprime crisis. The origins of the subprime crisis, from my analysis, and I think some of the investigations would back this up, and I think official investigations bear this out, lie in the change of the business models of the credit rating agencies. In around the 1970s, their business model changed. Up until then, investors delegated due diligence to the credit rating agencies, for which they paid a fee. When bond issuers started paying rating agencies, the financial interests of the rating agencies converged with those of the issuing banks. And that, if you like, set the background for what was then to occur. Credit rating agencies had no access to the underlying data on mortgage-backed securities and their derivatives. They didn't see what was underlining these loans, so they had to rely on historic mortgage data. And if you look at the official investigations, they actually colluded with the issuing banks to optimize the risk profile of securities in order to award AAA ratings. So we end up with dubious assets based on dodgy data rather than reality. Now, if you think about it, all the players in this particular game had a strong incentive to perpetuate it. So if you think about the borrowers, they bought houses they couldn't afford or that they could offload at a profit before the mortgage payments went up. These guys were earning commissions. The lenders were removing toxic debt from their balance sheet, presumably enabling them to repeat the process. The investors were enjoying exceptional yields on AAA bonds. The issuing banks were making money not just from issuance fees, but they were also trading their book, sometimes against their own customers, as we've recently discovered. And meanwhile, the ratings agencies enjoyed a fourfold increase in their revenues from 2000 to 2007. These are very strong structural incentives. This is not about honesty of people or dishonesty of people. It's about structural incentives that you put in place and people respond to incentives. Had these people, the investors, actually not relied on the credit rating agencies for due diligence, but actually undertook their own due diligence, maybe, and just maybe, the subprime crisis could have been avoided. Maybe. Which brings us on to man-made global warming. or anthropogenic global warming, and I will use the term AGW for shorthand, and I hope you'll forgive me for that. As we go through this presentation, I need you to keep in mind this, that only after scientific papers have been rigorously and independently scrutinized and verified can a theory be said to have any credibility. And even then, even after it's been through this process of scrutiny, new evidence can emerge to discredit it. And this is the way science works in almost every field, except climate science. Or more specifically, a very narrow area of climate science, which is supporting this man-made global warming hypothesis. So what is the hypothesis? And this comes from a leaflet distributed by the Met Office last year. And it's pretty succinct, and I think nobody would have a problem with that. Sorry? Well, this is the hypothesis. It's clear what the hypothesis is saying. They're saying that we're creating the conditions for our own demise if we don't do something about it, and CO2 is the culprit. So in order to assess the truth or veracity of this claim, we need to start with the greenhouse effect. And forgive me if I'm telling you stuff that you regard as rather basic, but I think it's quite important to understand the process and the arguments that are being put forward. Shortwave radiation from the sun warms the Earth's surface. Longwave or infrared radiation is re-emitted back into space. A proportion of this heat collects in the greenhouse gases in the troposphere. And the greenhouse gases absorb that heat and they radiate it back to Earth as long-wave radiation. Now you can forget the car and the factories. The greenhouse effect predates man by millions of years. It's been around for years. And without it, the Earth would be a very hostile place, some 30 degrees cooler than it is today. Now, if you think about where the Earth is going to be hottest in this scenario, where the sun strikes hardest, it's in the tropics. And so what we should observe over the tropics is this heat accumulating in the troposphere. And yet, satellite and weather balloon data show no evidence of this excess heat in the troposphere. On the left, oh, sorry, wrong button. On the left is what the climate models predict. A big red hotspot over the tropics. And this is what, in this case, weather balloon data show. Nothing. This paper by David Evans explains this in some depth, and there's a briefer paper just below it. This paper here is based on satellites, and it comes from John Christie at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. John Christie is a leading contributor to the IPCC process, and he barely gets a mention. He tries to speak out against the IPCC process, the way it's obscured all of this evidence. And he's one of their contributors. And he has to use very diplomatic language, as we will go on to understand. Now, this one fact, because this is what the whole case is based on, climate models. It's not based on reality. And reality does not reflect what the models predict. Einstein said, "No amount of experimentation can ever prove me right. One experiment can prove me wrong." And this is it. In spite of this, you'd think, that would be the end of it. And how many of you have any of you actually seen this before, other than Michael and Jed, who I sent the slides to? Excellent. We'll discuss it afterwards if we may, but... right. So, okay, we'll come to that. That'll be interesting. So the mere fact that none of you have seen this diagram illustrates the problem that I'm going to elucidate as we go through this. So we've been deluged with other evidence that we're sowing the seeds of our demise. We've all seen the pictures. So let's go through that. CO2. You've probably seen this if you've seen Al Gore's film. This is a plot of CO2 versus temperature over the last 800,000 years. Al Gore says in the film something like, "Say, they kind of fit together, don't they?" What he neglects to point out, and had he made his film 4 or 5 years earlier, he would be forgiven for not pointing it out. But he was fully aware on the release of his film that temperature increases actually precede CO2 by some 800 years. The Met Office, in the brochure they distributed last year, actually admit that CO2 follows temperature. So where is the logic that says CO2 is now driving temperature? Not least because it failed to stop the cooling between 1940 and 1980, when CO2 emissions were exploding through the post-war industrial boom. And you will hear a lot of stories about the effects of what doubling CO2 will do. The current concentration in the atmosphere is 390 parts per million. It's a very small amount. Over most of the past 600 million years, CO2 concentrations have been in excess of 1,000 parts per million and have been as high as 7,000 parts per million. CO2 is a very small player in the greenhouse. And as far as its physical properties are concerned, if you imagine a dry sponge and you put it under a tap and you've got water flowing into the sponge, it'll fill up with water. Over time, as the sponge fills, water begins to drip out the bottom, until at saturation point, the inward flow of water equals the outward flow of water. CO2 heat absorption is not dissimilar. In other words, at the current level, CO2 is not going to make a huge difference in terms of the amount of heat absorbed. So, in the face of this, what are we told? Oh, well, what you don't understand is CO2 is driving feedbacks in water vapor. Now, from the diagram I showed you earlier, there's no physical evidence that this is happening. And this paper by Roy Spencer, also at the University of Alabama in Huntsville, and he's done a lot of work on both satellite temperature and feedbacks, and I'd recommend you go and visit his site. There is no evidence of feedback. The next thing we get to is, well, the world is hotter than it's ever been, and CO2 is the only explanation. So if we want to examine that, we have to think about temperature. Now, when I started on this journey, I had this sort of rather simplistic notion that it was fairly simple to come up with a global temperature. There is no definitive long-term record of global temperatures. It doesn't exist. If we go back to 1850, from then we have some surface temperature records, but they're incomplete. The earlier records are restricted to a relatively small number of locations in the Northern Hemisphere. And even the more modern records have their problems. Now, measurement stations that were once sited in remote locations are now surrounded by buildings and tarmac. This is the urban heat island effect. What that means, to give you an example, is San Remo Airport can be 10 degrees cooler than the city. And none of the, for want of a better word, propaganda that you see about temperature that is put out by the IPCC and those scientists that support the theory, actually, they say that they account for this, but it doesn't go anywhere near the real effect. Anthony Watts has done a huge amount of research into temperature, and I would strongly recommend you go to his site. What's up with that? In fact, there was something quite interesting in the last couple of days about the urban heat island effect in the Arctic, which, when I prepared this presentation, I said, urban heat island effect doesn't affect the Arctic, but it appears that near some stations it can have an effect, but leaving that aside. But go and have a look. Then we have the so-called proxy data. They're not reliable either, and we're going to come on to that. Weather balloons are accurate, but they don't give us a global picture. So satellites, which have been running since about 1979, are about the only reliable measure of temperatures. They cover about 80% of the globe. And then, of course, if we want to think about the long term, we have anecdotal and archaeological evidence from history. Now, there's quite a lot of evidence of the medieval warm period. And contrary to claims made by the IPCC, it was pretty general across the northern hemisphere. And I think I read a study that somewhere in South America there was evidence of a warm period around the same time. The Roman, Holocene, and the medieval warm periods were likely much warmer than it is today. And I can only say to you that you've got to go and look at evidence and sort of piece it together. But the likelihood is it was a lot warmer than it is today. For example, the Vikings settled Greenland from about 980 to 1400 AD. And I got this from a book that Michael recommended to me a while back, Collapse by Jared Diamond. The Vikings farmed and they buried their dead. Burial sites have been found in the permafrost layer. So it was likely much warmer in the medieval warm period. And when the Little Ice Age came on, the settlements collapsed. The Vikings were wiped out of Greenland. And we know there were extremely low sunspot counts during the Maunder and Dalton minima. And that coincided with exceedingly low temperatures. The first assessment report from the IPCC was formed in, I always forget the date, it's either 86 or 88. This is their first assessment report. And there we have it, a medieval warm period, Little Ice Age. I think, looking at that, I'd be nodding and saying, yeah, that looks about right. But clearly that wasn't going to convince us of the urgent need to cut back our CO2 emissions. And so by the time we get to the third assessment report, we get to this. This comes out of a paper by a gentleman by the name of Michael Mainelli, a name you may have heard. And in this paper, he attempted to prove that the 1990s were the hottest decade of the millennium. And it's been subject to quite a lot of controversy. It's used extensively within the third assessment report. I've forgotten how many times it appears, but it appears all over the third assessment report. It's been used extensively in the media and then by the IPCC generally to promote this idea of global warming. And of course it appears in Al Gore's film. But where's the medieval warm period and the Little Ice Age? Doesn't make sense to me. So, two gentlemen, Steve McIntyre, who's a retired geologist and mathematician, and an economics professor and statistician called Ross McKittrick, put together a critique of the hockey stick. And what they found was fundamental statistical flaws in man's methodology and cherry-picking of data to produce the hockey stick. Now, as you can imagine, the AGW lobby went berserk trying to suppress and dismiss this and credit McIntyre and McKittrick. The Wegman Committee was appointed by the US Senate and the three academics to adjudicate on the hockey stick. And the Wegman Committee found in favour of McIntyre and McKittrick. Now, how many of you know that? Excellent. You've been doing your homework. Now, this is staggering that here we have a room full of people, and let's say you're representative of people in this country, and you've never known about this. I think it's fair to say that the hockey stick and all its derivatives have no credibility. And this paper, produced this year by McShane and Weiner, confirms how unreliable these hockey stick reconstructions are. Which brings us to ClimateGate, which you probably have heard of. Now, what these emails confirmed was that the community behind these temperature reconstructions habitually adjusted data to make it fit the hypothesis. And Michael Mann and Dr. Phil Jones, who headed up the crew unit, actually resisted requests for data, methodologies and programs in direct contravention of the scientific method. Remember what I asked you to remember. Scientific method. You have to be able to share your data and your method so that people can verify it. Otherwise, nobody can actually establish that what you're saying is accurate. And they resisted that. This file, Harry, read me. If you're a bit of a geek and you want to go and read a programmer's notes, it just confirms how sort of poorly documented and put together the programs were, and it confirms the sort of haphazard nature of data storage. Hide the Decline is quite an interesting one, and it goes beyond the original hockey stick. It's been going on ever since. And this relates to Michael Mann's trick in his original paper that was published in the science journal Nature, where he spliced surface temperature data to the proxy record. So if we go back, so what he did was at this point the proxy record went down, but the surface temperature went up. So he spliced the two together. Now maybe within the papers at the back of the IPCC report, in the sort of body of the report, this is probably disclosed in some way. But the summary for policymakers, which everybody reads, nobody reads through the whole scientific report, there's no mention of this. And this one fact alone totally discredits the proxy data and the hockey stick. The fact that he had to manipulate the data to get that shape. We've had 3 inquiries into ClimateGate. The one member of the select committee who has scientific qualifications is Graham Stringer. He dissented from all the findings subject to a vote. All the votes went 3-1. He dissented on every one. They left the examination of the science to Lord Oxburgh. Lord Oxburgh is chairman of the Carbon Capture and Storage Association and the wind energy company Falck Renewables. Clearly a conflict of interest. And what's more, he let the University of East Anglia select the papers for review, thereby avoiding the very papers that were the subject of the ClimateGate investigation. If the Russell panel read the emails, it certainly wasn't. The Russell panel was to investigate wrongdoing, and if they'd read the emails, it certainly wasn't reflected in their reports. They failed to probe the deletion of emails that were ostensibly to subvert freedom of information requests. And I can do nothing other than say to you, go and read the emails. There's a link here. This guy, John Costello, is a physicist, and he provides the emails in raw form, and he provides some context and expansion of acronyms, so you know what's going on, because some of the stuff's a bit oblique. But if you go and read the emails yourself, then you will not be able to reconcile the emails to what the reports have said. And I also put here a link to the evidence that was submitted to the select committee. The overwhelming, if you did it by weight, the skeptical evidence is here and the pro evidence is here. And that is not reflected in the findings of the report. And as I made a submission, I got a full copy. So where we are, these hockey stick temperature reconstructions have no validity, is that we have no evidence that temperatures today are unprecedented. And on the contrary, we've got every reason to believe that it's been much warmer than before. Now, when I put this presentation together, I had 43 slides, and I had to be quite ruthless in taking them out, because Jed told me I had half an hour. But there is a chart, and I'm kicking myself that I didn't include it, that shows temperatures over the last 800,000 years. And if you look at the last 2 ice ages, coming out of the last 3 ice ages, there's a very steep shoot up from the ice age, and then there's a sort of slowly meandering down through the interglacial until the next ice age. And that's happened in all three ice ages, including emergence from the last one. And I don't personally believe that we're ever going to see that peak temperature when we came out of the ice age. But that's a personal view just from logic. But anyway, I digress. So in spite of all this evidence that CO2 is not warming the planet, we need to understand why it's warming. Oh, no, we don't. Sorry, there's a bit more evidence to throw in. Chris Landsea is one of the leading hurricane specialists. He resigned from the IPCC in 2005 in protest over repeated unsubstantiated claims that global warming was causing extreme weather. And this particular study from 2007 shows that over the last 100 years, there is no correlation between global warming or climate change, whatever word you want to use, and the frequency or incidence of hurricanes. And more recently, and I actually picked this up off the World Service a couple of weeks ago, this guy was being interviewed at Science in Action at about 2 o'clock in the morning, I happened to hear it. And he's just completed a study looking at, it says what he was studying, disaster losses in the context of anthropological climate change, anthropogenic climate change. And he found no evidence either. What he did find is that increased losses are due to expanding populations in vulnerable areas, which is not really surprising when you think about it. So, moving on. Polar ice. This is the one that really excited me. We've all seen the pictures of ice shelves crashing into the sea, and it looks really dramatic. And I did ask Jed if we could get a globe for this, but you're going to have to imagine I've got a globe here. Equatorial waters are pushed down from the equator, and the warm water is pushed down from the equator and circulates the southern oceans. So by the time it reaches the Antarctica, a lot of the heat is dissipated. Now, there is a big peninsula of ice that juts out into this warm stream, and not surprisingly, it melts. But in other parts of the Antarctic, the ice is growing. And there are studies that show this. In fact, there's evidence of cooling in the Antarctic from 1966 to 2000. When we get to the north, as the equatorial waters move northwards, they can't circulate because of the land masses, so they form gyres and spirals. And yes, they cause warming, and they cause Arctic ice to melt. But recent studies show that the oceans are now cooling and the ice is growing again. And then finally we have, I heard on Radio 4 this morning that Rajendra Pachowdhury's job is now finally at stake over this claim that they were going to disappear by 2035. 2035. A 2009 study from the Laboratory of Hydraulics, Hydrology and Glaciology found that in the 1940s, alpine glaciers were melting faster than today. And they actually found that average temperatures in the 1940s were 8% higher than the long-term average. And they ascribe glacial depletion to solar radiation. So here we have a complete lack of evidence. We've got no hotspots in the atmosphere. We've got no evidence that CO2 is driving temperature. For the last 800,000 years, it's always followed temperature rather than driven it. Current temperatures appear to be within the bounds of natural variability. There's no evidence that CO2 is causing extreme weather events. The Antarctic has been broadly constant for most of the last 100 years, and although Arctic ice has been melting during the recent warming period, there are signs that it's growing again. And glacial retreat, we think, is solar radiation. So if CO2 is not driving temperature, what is? Well, the Arctic has probably the Arctic is quite a good laboratory because it actually accentuates the warming. Whatever warming we may have felt here down at 52 degrees or whatever the latitude is in the UK, up here it's been more extreme. Now, if you look at this, these are temperatures, the grey lines going up and down, and this is solar activity plotted. And that looks to me like a pretty good correlation. As opposed to this, the same temperatures plotted against CO2. Now, there's been such concentration and focus on CO2 is the big demon, that these areas are very poorly understood. They've not received the attention and funding that they should. And solar cycles, and I haven't got time in this presentation to go into any depth of any of this stuff, but to give you some idea, solar cycles or solar influence is not limited to sunspots. The duration of a solar cycle, the longer it is, the weaker the solar effect. Also, solar magnetism emitted as it reaches the Earth interacts with galactic cosmic rays. And galactic cosmic rays stimulate the formation of reflective cloud cover, or albedo. And over the period of warming, which is roughly 1980 to 2000, there was an increase in a decrease in albedo, which corresponded with an increase in solar magnetism, and that would account for the warming. And it's not straightforward either, because these natural cycles, the solar cycle, interferes or interacts with other cyclical phenomena. You've all probably heard of the El Niño Southern Oscillation, which produces a warming pulse every 4 to 5 years of varying intensity. And since the peak El Niño of 1998, there are signs that the El Niño peaks are getting lower, it's diminishing. The Pacific decadal oscillation has a 30-year cycle. And the reversal of the PDO, as it's called, Pacific decadal oscillation, the reversal in 2007 depressed temperatures worldwide and heralds a 30-year negative cycle, hence the predictions of cooling. The Atlantic oscillation is around 60 to 70 years, and it produced the warming spike in the 1940s, and probably accounts for a lot of what we've seen in the last warming spell. Now these cycles, as I've said, you've got 4 to 5 years, you've got 30 years, you've got 60 to 70 years. And there are other cycles which I won't go into. But these cycles, sometimes they cancel each other out, and sometimes they work in harmony. And when they work in harmony, obviously the effect is much greater, and that's what we've been seeing over the last few years until the peak, which the peak on global basis is 1998. But there is evidence the Arctic continued warming long after that, something to do with these ocean oscillations. As I said, it's not well understood. But to give you an idea of the forces at work, this is a plot of temperatures since about 1900, the black line. The IPCC projections are for global warming continuing up here. What has actually happened since 98 is we're around here. Now, I'm going to show you something a bit later that shows we've ticked up again. Now, what these blue lines are scenarios looking at the warm-cold phases of the PDO. These are different scenarios depending on which sort of cycle we get. If we get one like 1790 to 1820, then we're going to go right down here. Oops, sorry, finger on button. If we go down to this one, which was 1880 to 1915, then we'll go here. Or from 1945 to 1977, around there. And this is why some climate specialists are predicting cooling. And the case for cooling rather than warming is indications of a weak solar cycle. They've been waiting for this next solar cycle for some time, and it looks as though it's coming in very weak. We've got a reversal of the Pacific decadal oscillation, which heralds a 30 years cooling phase. And we've got increased albedo, or reflective cloud cover. All of those suggest that we've got a period of cooling. And there are some specialists predicting another little ice age. And in spite of all this, we're told the science is settled. Now, some of the scientists, and these are eminent international scientists, many of whom are climate specialists, some of whom are retired, they have no worries about speaking out. But they write in these submissions of scientists being afraid to speak out, because anyone who speaks out is in danger of losing credibility and funding for their work. And the converse of that is, if you can prove a climate change handle to your research, you're likely to get funding. John McLean analysed the fourth assessment report, and what he found that only 53 authors and 5 reviewers could be explicitly said to support the idea of man-made global warming. So the claims of thousands of scientists, and go and look at the Copenhagen climate change submission. So how can this happen? And as we saw in the subprime crisis, when people have a structural incentive to adhere to a particular view or course of action, it's quite difficult to resist. And when you think how universally, globally accepted this concept of climate change is, it's not surprising. It was only once I started digging that I had any idea this information existed. The IPCC's mission is to assess human-induced climate change, human-induced global warming. Human-induced, not, whether natural variation has anything to do with it. The chairman, Rajendra Pachaudhry, has commercial interests which benefit from his involvement in the IPCC. That narrow body of scientists and climate modelers who are being funded to produce this evidence of global warming, they have a huge amount to lose should this theory be abandoned. Money is probably less important to them, although they need their money for funding, but the prestige they would lose through being found out is just overwhelming. Carbon trading, and I spoke to a young lady, Catherine, in the audience who talked a bit about carbon trading, and I've long had this problem with carbon trading, even when I believed in the idea that you could set a cap for people's footprint and then trade securities on it just left me extremely uneasy. But anyway, it's there, and it's 140 billion in 2008. The only reason it was less in 2009 was because of the credit crunch. And if the US implement cap and trade, this is going to go through the roof. And Goldman Sachs, who were one of the principal players in the subprime crisis, they'd just been fined by the SEC $500 million, which was peanuts to them, but a lot of money to me. They've got a major stake in carbon trading, and you can reckon there's quite a lot of people who have got a lot of money riding on carbon trading. And all the ancillary people, the carbon footprint auditors, the climate change pundits, the politicians who've nailed their colours to this particular mast of no global warming, they've got a huge amount to lose should this fall apart. So these are all structural incentives to obscure the truth. And that's my message to you today, that this is structural. It's not about individuals. But having said that, Al Gore is a major investor in climate change and carbon trading. Through Generation Wealth Management, he owned 2.63% of the Chicago Climate Exchange. So there are a lot of influential people who have much to lose. Power, prestige, and of course money. So what about those carbon credits? The carbon credits are based on flawed climate models and discredited hockey sticks. Dubious assets based on dodgy data and not reality. These people in the middle, the IPCC and the pro-global warming fraternity, be it the media or anyone else, have suppressed, dismissed or ignored all the contrary evidence. We've seen in this room, you've not seen any of this information. Earth's climate is a complex, cyclical, chaotic system, natural system. And it's influenced by solar cycles and oceanic cycles. And the only way you're going to find that out is not to delegate due diligence to those who've got a vested interest in and a prior commitment to the man-made global warming hypothesis. You've actually got to go and look for yourself. Finally, these slides are available at outersight.org. And I've put up these particular links I think are well worth visiting. I mean, there's a lot more links on Outersight to a lot more information than I've tried to present here. We could be here all afternoon. If you do nothing else, you know, it's taken me a long time. I've spent a lot of non-working hours, long nights and weekends, delving around, reading around the internet, looking at scientific papers. And it's difficult. But if you do nothing else, I would recommend this book, Chill by Peter Taylor. And I don't get a commission on this, by the way. Peter Taylor is an ecologist of some 30 years standing, and he's worked in UN and governmental type situations before on pollution control, oceanic pollution and nuclear pollution. And he's examined the broad range of science. And all of this information about natural cycles and the inherent bias in the IPCC system and the sort of the governmental take on politicization of science generally. He covers all that in his book. The foreword is written by Jackson Davis, who wrote the first draft of the Kyoto Protocol. And he says it's a must-read for everyone on both sides of the debate. And I would really recommend it. Because if you want to get up to speed quickly, that's probably the best way. He actually credits carbon dioxide with more culpability in global warming than I do. Everything I've read tells me that carbon dioxide has no measurable effect on temperature. Don't look at Wikipedia. A gentleman by the name of William Connolly from 2003 rewrote 5,428 entries and suppressed entries that were contrary to the AGW hypothesis. He's also connected with Michael Mann's site, realclimate.org. So I'd like to close because Michael's waving at me, and I think I've run well over time. Sorry. I'll leave you with two thoughts. Carbon is a fundamental building block of life, essential to our survival. CO2 is not a pollutant. So go do the research and find out about the 21st century carbon caper. Thank you for your time and patience. And I'm going to leave you with the satellite record of temperatures. Thank you very much. Sorry, Michael.
Well, good day, and thank you, Clive, for what I think is certainly going to be was a stimulating presentation, should lead to a very stimulating discussion. I'd be surprised if you haven't offended several people in the room, myself included, so I'm sure we can go on. I just wanted to warm things up, and then I'll open to questions. You're speaking here in a way where I was reminded of a Mel Gibson film where he's, I think it's called Conspiracy Theory. So is this a conspiracy, or is this just a cock-up?
I don't hold with, there is no grand blueprint where Al Gore sat in his back room saying, I've got a good idea to make a fortune. But what happens in these situations is that a set of circumstances comes together where people's interests converge. Peter Taylor refers to it as a collusion of interests, and I think that's quite a good sort of phrase to sort of describe it, where if you think about the subprime crisis, everybody in that game had something to gain from the perpetuation of the sale of mortgage-backed securities and their derivatives. Nobody would gain from holding their hand up and saying, hang on, these are dodgy. I mean, I recall looking at, I wasn't involved in the subprime crisis, and so I was a sort of disinterested bystander, and I didn't have the time to spend that I've spent on climate change. But it didn't compute to me, and like a lot of things I see structure. Somebody told me about a structured product, that if the gold price doesn't go to 1900, then you're guaranteed this fantastic return. And the market has a way of breaking that. So it's not a conspiracy, it's people working to their own, according to their own particular incentives. And when those incentives converge, they can create this situation where nobody will listen to the truth. And we've seen it in so many situations, and I don't want to sort of get off the subject into Iraq and all the other things, but it does happen.
Yeah, you did close on one point where, frankly, I do feel you are just bluntly wrong. CO2 is a pollutant. CO2 in concentrations will kill people. I did run the calculations. On current trends, it would be about 10,000 AD when it would reach a concentration that would kill us, but let's leave that to one side. You seem to have done your homework, sir.
Can I before you do the CO2 as a pollutant, just bear in mind that there are studies that show tree growth and plant growth has increased quite significantly, and Dutch growers actually put it in their greenhouses to grow stuff. Yeah.
Anything can kill you in concentrations.
That.
But at in 10,000 AD on current rates of increase, we would die. But we can probably wait a while before we have to solve that one. Sir, you did your homework. What did you think of what Clive was saying?
Well, I agree with him.
Good.
What I find interesting is if you look, for example, at the monk rolls at Swithin's Priory, take that from 1280 to 1332, you will actually see the monks complaining and talking about how the weather's getting worse and worse, the rainfall goes, the crops grow. The Greenland settlement's quite interesting because that probably died out slightly earlier than 1400, I think. And also, of course, they'd settled Vinland as well. We also know from archaeology that you could grow grapes in the old form, not the new type of grape where you can actually go further north. You could grow grapes as far north as York, which the Romans did. And if you read books like The Long Summer, in some ways, if carbon has had an effect, it's actually stopped us tipping back into a new ice age. As I remember as a young undergraduate, these are not highlights, by the way. I remember as a young undergraduate in this area, we were talking about were we actually going to have a new ice age, and a number of my professors back in the 1960s and early 1970s were looking absolutely terrified that, actually ice was going to re-emerge in the Northern Hemisphere. So, yes, I agree with your central thesis, and I'm amazed that no one else, apart from me in the room, knew the hockey stick thesis had been discredited. Because I thought that was fairly common knowledge, but it obviously isn't. Because, it is complete and utter rubbish, the hockey stick hypothesis. I think I'm not quite as, how shall I say, gung-ho as you are about it. The other thing which I also noticed, if you looked at some of at Scientific American, there was an interesting theory on there that at one stage the Earth was outside of an area of the sun's rays, at which stage it was actually much more suitable for life than it is today. And it's gradually, as the sun increases in power, we become a less habitable place. And I suspect in the long term that's far more frightening for us than anything that carbon dioxide and what the Chinese are digging out of the ground at the moment can do.
Thank you. Sir. Would you mind just saying who you are and where you're from?
Yeah, I'm Charles Hopkinson-Woolley from Towers Capital, but this is an entirely personal comment. I'm delighted because I've been very sceptical about this for some time. I had some basic scientific training at university, and one of the things that we used when conducting experiments was to have a control. Control is a very useful thing to have in an experiment. It's something which is not affected by the observations you're making. And we do have a control here. We have a control that we can use. It's called Mars. Mars has ice caps at its poles, like our planet. And those polar caps have been melting steadily over the last 20, 30 years, because I remember looking at Mars through my telescope as a kid and seeing those ice caps, and they're virtually gone now. So that suggests that if there is warming, and there does seem to be some warming, that it's more to do with solar output than with anything we're doing here. But I don't know whether that's something you've looked at.
No, I'm afraid not. There's a lot to look at, and I think my objective today is not to try and convince anyone, other than the fact that you cannot rely on what you're being told, and that you have to look for yourself. If you want to know what's going on, you cannot rely on the IPCC, because they have a vested interest in man-made global warming, and that seems to be shared by the media.
Now we got some hands. Gentleman in the front, gentleman behind. And I'd like to have somebody who's in the carbon trading arena speak up. I'm
definitely not one of them. Okay, my name's Stuart Millman. I'm a self-employed corporate financier. The thing that I think has caused part of the problem is it's got muddled up between global warming and whether it's good to burn all the fossil fuels you can lay your hands on when you might run out of them. And that, it doesn't seem to me to be a good idea to keep burning things in great quantities when they take tens or hundreds of millions of years to create. And that's a legitimate objection to creating all your energy from fossil fuel. Of course, the creation of energy from fossil fuel does in fact create CO2. So there is a legitimate argument that says, really, I don't like the idea that we keep burning things and actually, incidentally, creating more CO2. Whether that's got anything to do with climate change, I severely doubt.
Can I just raise one minor issue? I mean, there is this view that by reducing our CO2 emissions, we have the derivative effect of reducing our reliance on fossil fuel. And that would be fine, except that it's an enormously costly way of going about it rather than attacking the root of the problem. But more importantly, it's actually putting our food security at risk. We're building a power station on Tyneside, which is going to burn 800,000 tonnes of wheat a year. Now, our exports currently run at about 3 million tonnes. There are more biofuel plants under construction, which will actually consume a further 3 billion tonnes of wheat. So we're going to turn from being a net importer of wheat to an exporter of wheat, to an importer of food from the world markets. And if we're looking at a scenario where the world gets cooler, crop yields will fall, and food security will become a very important issue. And also there are many other derivative adverse effects from current policies, carbon sinks. We're removing indigenous people in ancient forests to create carbon sinks of eucalyptus. And there are many other instances which I won't go into now. So although it's a good idea, and I'm firmly of the belief that we need to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels, attacking CO2 as the problem is the wrong way to go about it.
Catherine Porter, was it? You work in the markets. You're right next to the gentleman. Yeah, go on.
Okay, so I'm Catherine Porter. I work for ZYen. In our business, we obviously do have some carbon trading activities. And I think the only observation I'd really make about that is people come at the carbon market from two different angles. Some people see it as an asset they can trade and they can make profits from, that they can invest in. Other people see it that they have an exposure to carbon prices. Within their business, they have to pay in order to emit carbon. And so they have price risk associated with it that they'd like to manage. And so you have an industry that's grown up to try and help people, reduce the fluctuations of their profits that are derived from that carbon price risk. And so, I actually have a lot of sympathy for the ideas expressed today, because my own personal view has been, yes, I think we observe climate change, but climate change is a natural phenomenon. And I've been by no means convinced that it's been, man-made or unnatural in its sort of recent activity.
Right. Thank you. Any other hands up there? Gentleman here at the back.
Yes, Paul Shari. I was very interested to hear all that was said, and would say that I'm in pretty full agreement with everything I heard. What I think comes out of it most importantly, and I make this comment against the background of having done a degree of studying of economics, climatology, and statistics, as well as obviously financial matters. The whole scenario is, as you've explained, very complex, many interrelated factors, and dabbling with one may be fairly irrelevant. Just mentioning the cosmic effect, which is totally external to what we're doing on our own planet. But the great thing about it is that, like so many things, it has the potential to become a political football. And we know that politicians, they latch onto something for vote-catching reasons, and then they have to go through with it. They then create things like carbon trading, which is just another means of generating something for people to do that doesn't actually cure anything in the end. Possibly the single most important thing that wasn't mentioned, I feel, is that once you start tinkering with these things, there is a cost to the environment of the tinkering. And I mean, the most obvious example is the controversy over whether you generate electricity by nuclear power, which is quite effective at generating it, but what you do with decommissioning. That's a sort of supreme example. And I think, you know, having had a private discussion with one of the scientists who does not advise politicians and does not have to be re-elected and does not have to worry about funding for his own research, the only thing you really can draw out of all this from the human angle is that in reality you won't stop people from progressing their standard of living. My Chinese friends have got off their bicycles and into their cars with prosperity, and now there's hardly room to cycle on the roads in China if you want to. And, you know, if you have somebody like Ken Livingstone painting little cycle lanes in England, it's pretty well irrelevant. But I think the biggest danger is people just sort of making a political football out of it and really getting nowhere.
Well, I'm going to try and move to some of the closing remarks. Before I do so, I'm kind of curious. Could I have a show of hands of those who believe that the AGW theory is true, those who believe it's false, and those who are undecided? So I'll start with the believers. Hands up, those of you who believe it's true. Those who believe it's false. And those who are undecided. Interesting. You've done well today, Clive. Actually, I should ask a fourth question. Yes. And people who came here and may have changed their mind in some way. Hands up those who've changed their mind a little bit based on Clive's presentation. Interesting. Well, there. Yes, I too find this fascinating. There were some real resonances there. I spoke with Al Gore in 2007 about a half a dozen errors in his presentation before the film, and was surprised that it was sort of, it doesn't matter.
Can I, just before you round up, can I just...
I'm not rounding up.
Oh, right, go on.
I had a discussion as well in the 90s with the University of East Anglia trying to get their data and was roundly rebuffed. So I've been there. That you haven't covered, for example, the smoothing elements in the data, which is another thing, because if you look at climate change as a hypothesis, one of the evidences is going to be increasing volatility, but if the historic data has been smoothed, by definition you'll find it, which they did. And finally, I think, gentlemen, there your point's absolutely right. We're going to see pressure, and so maybe whilst climate change as a theory is an issue, decarbonization and dealing with increasing numbers of people and their desire for affluence and technology has to be squared. So I think these have all been excellent points for discussion. Just before I wrap up, I would like to give the floor to Clive for your closing remarks, Clive.
Sorry. Okay. Al Gore's film, I have a real problem with. I watched it and I thought it was very slick, very well done. But what really, I think, got me really angry was that this film was circulated to secondary schools in the United Kingdom, and it was only the actions of an individual challenging it in the High Court that actually had to get circulated with a rider. The teachers had to read out that there were 9 fundamental errors. There's actually a lot more than 9 errors in this film, but the High Court judge agreed that there were 9 errors. So you can imagine school kids sitting watching a film. Before the film, somebody reads out some dry document saying there are 9 errors in this film. They're not going to take any notice of that. We're brainwashing a generation with bogus science, and I think that's the thing that really upsets me more than anything. I mean, I know, I've been around long enough to know that these things happen, that, you know, we're not told the truth about things, and subprime crises will happen, and, you know, carbon trading will take off, I'm sure. You know, irrespective of what I say today, it's going to happen, and people will make money, and sooner or later the House of Cards is going to fall, and there's going to be a big inquest. I know that'll happen, but I think brainwashing the next generation with bogus science is very bad news. And I'll just leave you with the last slide, which is a sort of summary of what I've said. So I won't go through it. I'll leave the floor to Michael. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank you, Clive. I mean, I've taken away, I think, 3 big points. One, a very strong reminder that science is about hypotheses and not about and not about truth. It's about the search for truth, not the truth itself, and that the science is out in many ways, and I don't think we should allow ourselves as financial professionals to do anything other than seek it out and make up our own minds as it rolls along. I think the second thing, which I don't think you had the time to spend on, but your ultimate hypothesis here is that there might be some other kind of financial crisis looming within this. I just thought I'd leave some of you with some ideas of what this might mean personally. The current UK CO2 emissions per capita are around the 11 to 12 tons per person per annum. The government targets are in 2050 to get this down to 1 or 2 tons. That's approximately a 10-ton reduction per person. Current price of carbon is 14, and anybody who's trading on those markets says it really ought to be 25, 30, 35, 40. And you start multiplying those numbers together on a per annum basis, and you are looking at a minimum of about 600 euros per British family moving up. So the cost of getting it wrong could be quite material. I think the final thing, though, and I do think it's an important point raised indirectly and directly by people, is there are other reasons to decarbonize our economies. And that may well be just general pollution, it may well be energy security or food security, and that these in turn will potentially create investment opportunities. But I think Clive has done us a great service today, just reminding us not to take things too certainly. Just in closing then, and before we turn to thank Clive properly, could I ask you to please complete and return your evaluation forms? Jed and the team do look at these, and they make tremendous changes, like ensuring that I'm not allowed to chair again if you put all that down. So, you know, that'll be good. You'll save yourselves by filling those forms in. But I would really like all of us to join and thank Clive in the usual way for a great presentation.